Here's a little known fact. D.B. Cooper entered the jet carrying a small paper bag. What was in it and where did it come from? All right, folks, Eric Ulis here once again, of course. Let's talk about this paper bag that D.B. Cooper brought on board the jet with him. Now, it's a little known fact, and it's interesting because when we discuss the Cooper case, it's the one thing that rarely seems to get brought up. That is this paper bag that he brought on board. And, there are a couple of interesting things to contemplate or consider when looking into this paper bag. The first thing is, what was in the bag. Obviously, there was something in the bag because if it was empty, you would assume that he would have folded it up and stuck it in his jacket pocket or something of that nature. But no, it was open. The bag was actually open. Apparently something was in there. That said, nobody actually saw what was inside the bag. The other thing to consider is the bag itself and where it came from, because wherever the bag came from may well provide a clue of where D.B. Cooper came from. So let me describe the bag here, first of all. The bag was described as being about 14 inches wide, about being 12 inches tall, so a little wider than tall, and being about 4 inches deep. Interestingly, the bag is a paper bag. It's not described as having a handle or anything of that nature. And it's described as either being yellowish in color or greenish in color. So that's kind of what we're looking at. I think what's most notable about the bag, though, is nobody describes seeing any kind of logo or writing or anything of that nature on the bag. So that's something I'll pick up here in a second. Let's first talk a little bit about what could have been within the bag itself. Now, obviously, Cooper brought the bag on board the jet for a reason. I mean, there was a reason for the bag being brought on board, and I'm assuming that he had items in there that were a little too bulky to carry on his person, to put in his jacket pocket or something of that nature boarding the jet. I guess it would have been probably just a little too bulky looking or something off about it. So he decided to put the stuff presumably in a bag and carry it on board the jet with the briefcase and everything else. Now I'm assuming that what he probably would have had on board or in the bag there are some gloves. That would make sense to have some gloves to jump with. I think goggles are a very real possibility. Also some sort of knit hat. A helmet doesn't seem feasible because a helmet would have been too big. I don't see a helmet fitting in there because the bag was only like 4 inches deep. But yeah, some sort of knit hat makes sense. Perhaps a scarf, something like that. In other words, items to keep him warm as he jumps out of the plane or at least after he lands. I suppose it's also possible that he had some foodstuffs in there. Maybe the guy had a bologna sandwich or two in there, a couple candy bars, I don't know, power bars. I don't know if they had those back in 71, but something to eat. There may have been something to eat there as well. And maybe he had a flashlight or a compass, something along those lines as well that would have, I would imagine would have been of some use to the guy once he landed. But that's just all speculation on my part. But I think at a minimum, we can safely assume that he at least had some gloves in there for his hands. Goggles seems like a safe assumption as well, and maybe some sort of knit hat to keep the head warm, keep the heat in. So those are some things to consider there. Now, the interesting thing to consider is that when he jumped, he had to obviously put these items somewhere. Obviously, he didn't jump out of the plane at 200 miles an hour, 10,000 feet up, carrying a paper bag. We all know what's going to happen with that paper bag and everything inside of it. So everything that was in the bag had to go somewhere before he jumped. Gloves make sense. You put the gloves on. Goggles make sense. You could put goggles on if he had those on. I would imagine if he had a knit cap, he could have probably secured that tightly enough around his head to stay on his head when he jumped out of the plane. But anything else that he may have brought on board in the bag, whether it be food or flashlight or a compass or what have you, would have had to have gone somewhere else. And I think the obvious place to put that stuff would have been in the briefcase that, again, ostensibly carried the bomb. I don't think it was a real bomb. There's obviously some additional space in that briefcase. So it makes sense to me that he would maybe, stash a couple items in there and close it up before he actually jumps. It's a good thing to store those items with. And then the bag itself, because the bag itself was not left behind on the plane. Apparently that went with him. So I'm assuming he didn't just like throw it out the back, even though I suppose he could have. I'm assuming that he would have folded the bag up and just put it in the briefcase as well before he jumped. So that's the first thing. Now let's talk about the bag. Part of the reason that the bag is important in my mind is because, again, if we can determine where that bag came from, we may be able to determine where D.B. Cooper came from because he had the bag. Now, what I've noticed about this bag that's really interesting, and I think is of primary interest to me, is the fact that there's no printing on the bag. And that's unusual because the size of a bag almost reminds me of the kind of bag you would get if you went to a department store and bought a pair of shoes, and then they put the shoes that are in the little cardboard box into a bag, and you walk out the mall with it. It almost sounds like it's that sort of sized bag. But again, it doesn't have handles. It isn't described as having handles. So if there were handles, perhaps you cut those off with scissors. But the one thing that would be hard to cover up is if there's some sort of printing or something of that nature on the bag. And I've done a fair amount of research trying to find any kind of paper bag from that time, the 60s or 70s, that didn't have some sort of printing on it. And I'm telling you, it's damn near impossible. Obviously, any kind of bag that came from Sears or JCPenney or some other department store or even the grocery store invariably had some printing on the bag. So, I don't know. It's just a very interesting thing to contemplate, not to mention the color, the yellowish in color or greenish in color. One thing that I've speculated, and maybe somebody here can help us out with this and help me out with this, is whether the bag actually could have come from like a PX, a military PX store. In other words, is it possible that this is a bag that Cooper picked up while shopping on a military base somewhere? And I'm assuming, I don't know, but I'm kind of assuming that any kind of paper bags or whatever that would have been used by the PX probably didn't have a logo on it. I can't imagine it has like US Army on it or something of that nature. I would imagine it's just kind of a plain vanilla colored bag or green colored bag or whatever. So having said that, I don't know. I haven't come across any of these types of bags. Perhaps somebody out there, like I said, was in the military in the 60s or in the 70s and could verify that or provide a little bit of insight with respect to that. But it is something worth considering. And I think if we could drill down on this paper bag, there actually may be a story. It may have a story to tell. And it actually could be a very important story. Because sadly, folks, these are the kind of things that we're left looking at when it comes to D.B. Cooper and trying to figure out who this guy was, where he came from, and ultimately, hopefully, where the guy went. So that's it today. That's what I have for you folks. Again, as usual, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. I love hearing from you folks out there. And of course, if there's anybody out there that can provide a little bit of insight with respect to the possible whereabouts of this bag, or where it came from rather, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you as far as that goes, especially anybody that happened to be in the military during that era. And if there's somebody that can attest to what they were rolling with at the PX back in the old days there. So there we go, folks. Until next time, take care and cheers.